record. Okay, so I'm really, really pleased that we finally made it to get together on the same screen. We had I had a bit of time challenge, obviously. I'm thinking Google lied to me anyways, Diane, but I'm, I want to, I want to thank you, Diana, for coming on today. And I want to, um, I want to just explain to those watching that I met Diana via a friend in Australia who recommended that we do this interview together. And Diana has just written a new book that I'm going to get her to share about. But before we do that, I'm wondering, Diana, if you would do us a favor and just give us a little bit of an idea of your background and your professional background, certainly, or personal. If there's something that you want to share about yourself, that's good too. And then we'll take it from there because we want to talk about what you've written in this book, and I think it's pretty groundbreaking. So if that's okay with you, that's where we'll start.
Yes, yes, that's okay. Um, Look, I started my professional life as a primary school teacher, and from there, I did a master's degree and went into what we call school counseling. In America, it's called being a school psychologist. We call it district school counselor. And I have always been very interested in children with developmental issues, and my main interest is in children with behavioural and emotional disorders, not so much the neurodevelopmental problems. And so I was a school counsellor for a number of years, and then I became the regional specialist counsellor for emotionally disturbed children. And that was really my niche area, wondering about how adverse childhood events
Yes,
and particular types of trauma
yes,
resulted in children, kind of falling off their normal developmental trajectory. Um, so I decided then to do a PhD, and when I finished that, I joined the University of Sydney and became a lecturer in psychology. And I spent 31 years at the University of Sydney, and the last 13 of those was as professor of psychology. And I actually found a niche there in academia and spent the bulk of my time supervising PhD students and writing. So this book that we're going to talk about today is my 12th book. And most of those books relate in some way to children and their welfare. Um, and of course, my other great area of interest is psychotherapy and how psychotherapy can support the emotional development and recovery of people who've had serious adverse events in their early life, particularly. And then over the last 7 years, I've become immersed in this terrible pandemic of gender dysphoria.
yes.
And I started working with young people with gender dysphoria, one of only a very few people in Australia, because all of the states now have passed what we call conversion therapy ban
That's
legislation.
right.
And that refers to any therapy that isn't gender affirming therapy. So it is very difficult to practice in a non-gender affirming way in this country at the moment. And it's a terrible situation for parents of young people who are very insistent on the fact that they believe they're transgender and want the medical transition. So that brings us up to date. And one of the main issues that really concern me is how the professions, the medical, the teaching, educational, legal, sporting, political, how they've all fallen in behind this hoax of an ideology that is completely without scientific merit, completely without evidence, and they're using it to destroy a generation of young people. And that's what has prompted the book.
Thank you. We are so on the same page regarding early childhood, and, particularly in the area of those experiencing deep trauma. Also, when you're talking about falling in line with an ideology, our profession, and the whole medical profession has so failed our children. I mean, it is such a travesty. And I think one in my last book I wrote called "The Ultimate Deception: The Truth of Gender Affirming Care," I quote a professor who said that this is all a momentous step in the dark. And it's like we've fallen off a cliff and we're leading the whole society like sheep falling off a cliff into this abyss. And it is an abyss for young people when they begin to socially transition, and then particularly when they go on to puberty blockers and the medicalization and mutilation. You had a quote, and I'm going to read this again, and we're going to talk about the name of your book, and we're going to get that and have that on at the end of this video. But keep people hanging. This is a quote you put by Michael Foley. Absurdity is the new sublime. The good news is that while other resources are dwindling, absurdity is multiplying, flourishing, and filling the earth. I couldn't have imagined a better quote because this is exactly what we're seeing, and you called it a whole area of moral narcissism. So let's talk about this whole idea of non-binary and um, and then this whole trajectory that we now call, and you called it a pandemic. I totally agree, but the transgender pandemic, because there was never such an incredible spread of social contagion, I don't believe, that we've ever seen in our world that has devastated our children, and not just them, Diana, but parents
Mm.
and grandparents. Everyone is impacted by this phenomenon. So talk a little bit about that, and the whole idea of that genders become now immutable and biological sex is actually the new social construct.
Um, the the thought that all of the safeguards that we have for children in all of the different professions that we've mentioned have been stripped away, and parents have become the mythical boy with his finger in the dike, trying to stop the onslaught of the waters breaking in the dam. And parents have been very seriously impacted,
Yes.
um, and because there's no support for them. So they're fighting their young person on the one hand, trying to prevent the harm that they want to run so enthusiastically headlong into, which is the cross-sex hormones. And on the other hand, they've got people abusing them for being bad and abusive parents, for
Yes.
not automatically affirming them. And also now they cannot get proper help They're terrified to, go to the gender clinics because it's just a cookie cutter kind of approach where everybody gets affirmed. And this is a terrible situation because even though we've seen multiple um, social pandemics or social contagion in other fields like youth suicide, non-suicidal self-injury, eating disorders, even obesity, drug taking, we've seen how social factors actually enhance the uptake of very unhealthy behaviours. But nobody has ever said that non-suicidal self-injury is okay, or suicide is okay, or eating disorders are okay. The profession has been there to assist and support parents and families with their young person who has succumbed to these pathological behaviours. But this is one of the first times in history where the health professions are aiding and abetting the harming of young people.
So, and that goes back to what you were saying a little bit earlier about the conversion therapy um, bylaws and federal legislation in Canada. We have a federal legislation, and I think very much like yours in Australia. And the fines for professionals, even for I'm thinking psychological professionals, counselors, social workers, but also pastors and other leaders who would have input into a child or family's life. There is a 5-year prison sentence and or a $10,000 fine if they might suggest to a child, even to ask the child something as, innocuous as just saying, what makes you think that you're born in the wrong body? You cannot do that because of the this legislation. It is absolutely it has put such a chill on
Mm,
professionals, right? That
yeah,
they're terrified of losing their license. Absolutely, they will lose their license if they do not comply to gender affirming care only. That's the only type of therapy, which is just another whole issue because as therapists, we study all kinds of different types of therapy in order to help the individual, and we try and use the best fit for that individual, for their whatever they're coming to seek help for. And yeah, here's a it's a um, very discriminatory laws that shut us down. Now, and here's the reality. If a person is not questioning, or well, I wouldn't say even questioning, if they are heterosexual, that we could treat them in any way, that if they want to reduce um, their sexual, you know, their porn addiction or something like that, but you can't do that with um, any individual in the LGBTQ. And yet, um, I don't know about you, but we've had clients that that's exactly what they want. They find themselves consumed, so much of their life is consumed by sexuality, and so they would like to just reduce those thoughts and images, and yet you can't do that. And for the trans child who is just kind of starting on this trajectory, the parent might bring them to a medical doctor. I don't know if you've had this happen in your country, but I would assume you have, that the doctors are so complicit in this. And actually, it's like blackmail because they tell the parent, do you want a dead son or a live daughter? Or vice versa. you know,
Yeah.
as though if the parent does not affirm wholeheartedly, agree with the child's thoughts and behaviors and emotions of the moment, right? If they don't get 100% on board, the child will kill themselves. Um, and that doesn't seem to be apparent in the statistics that I've read, and certainly doesn't seem to flush itself out in Tavistock stats or any of the stats I've read regarding child suicide. Uh,
In
Now,
fact, the
we could
opposite is the case. Yeah. I have heard less of that trope in recent times because the evidence is in that gender dysphoric young people do not commit suicide at higher rates than other adolescents who've got other mental health issues.
that's right.
And in fact, the suicide rate after medical transition
Yes,
is much higher than the suicide rate before medical transition. And there've been a number of very good studies now where that trope about the dead son or the live daughter just doesn't fly. And so the trans people have let it go because they haven't got the evidence. They didn't have the evidence before, but now we've got evidence against. And
that's
there was a very important study done on with a 30-year follow-up of transgender people 30 years after medical transition, including so-called gender-affirming surgery. And the results showed that suicide was 19 times higher in the people who had undergone medical and surgical transition compared with the population matched for age and sex. And that was a very stark study that really ended that claim that um, transition was life-saving. The trans lobby still want to use that term, but they've tried to water down the association with suicide because the association just isn't there. So now they're talking about other things like puberty blockers being safe and reversible, and also life-changing, meaning in a positive way. And, the evidence is in that puberty blockers are A, not safe, B, not reversible, and C, not life-changing in a positive way. And hopefully, at some time in the not too distant future, the trans people will stop saying that it is safe and reversible and life-saving. So they adopt these slogans, which have absolutely no scientific merit, and propagate it as if it were truth. And this is what they've done right from the very beginning.
right.
So, for example, they have been rabidly opposed to the concept of social contagion.
Yes.
Because if they believed in or accepted the phenomenon of social contagion, it would ruin their theory that gender is innate and immutable. In other words, not subject to social forces or social influence.
Or
And so,
change.
or change, yeah.
Mhm.
So the very notion that social contagion exists implies that social forces can change behavior and belief, and they can't have that because the cornerstone of gender ideology is that gender trumps everything else, like sex, and is immutable and innate. And people just know inside themselves that, they are either born in the right body or born in the wrong body. So it's such a dishonest ideology. It's just utterly reprehensible in its propagation of disinformation and mistruths.
And I think, as you're talking, yeah, it's this trajectory that leads these children and adolescents and then adults onto this conveyor belt, right? I would call it a medical conveyor belt. And and the lies that are propagated to get the children into that place. And it's even it's it's hideous enough, but the lies that have been um, propagated through academia, through
Yeah.
teaching of our teachers,
Mhm. Yeah.
teaching in the education system, and then young young teachers in the public school system bring those lies of so-called research into the classroom. And what we see is an incredible indoctrination in the whole area of gender ideology, starting in kindergarten in Canada. And so we have the gender unicorn, and we have these images that um, begin to seed doubt in a child's mind and to seed confusion, which I I have to really sometimes just contain myself because that is so messing with our children's brains. And we are retraining their brains from those young ages to think that they could be something they can never be. Like in
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
wrong body, there's no such thing. And I just think here we have teachers being forced, because they are forced by our governments, to indoctrinate children, to teach them lies. And some of those teachers believe the lies so wholeheartedly. I mean, they really do believe it, and they really do think they're doing the right thing. That's the dichotomy here. It's really like you have this whole generation where this is the right thing to do because they've been trained that this is absolute
Well,
right.
the really big scandal here in Australia is that the school and the school principal have been given unfettered authority by
Yes,
the education department and the government to transition a child without the parents' knowledge or
that's right.
approval. And some of the parents do not know this has been happening until the school report comes home at the end of the year with a strange name on it. And parents have rung up the school and said, you've sent home the wrong report. It's got this child's name on it. And then they will finally understand and realise that for the entire school year, that child has been called their so-called preferred name and pronouns at school without any involvement of the parents in that process. And now these principles are protected by law, by legislation, to say that they have the right to act in loco parentis. I just think that is an appalling
Yes.
reversal of parental authority.
Well,
Secondly, the young teachers in training, they are being fed gender ideology as if it were biological truth. And I had a young patient who was also a trainee teacher, and he was telling me that, practically the entire semester was taken up with gender education. And he wrote an essay critical of what he'd been taught in class and was questioning the scientific validity and so forth. And his lecturer pulled him aside and said, if you want to pass this course, you will have to rewrite your essay. And so these teachers are being indoctrinated as trainees, and
yes.
then they're going into classrooms and teaching 5 and 6 year old children that they can choose their own gender and that even though they have a boy's body, they could be a girl, etc. There was a really interesting report of a school in the United States where a teacher performed what they call a transition ceremony for one of the students. And so this little 5-year-old boy, stands up and the teacher says, "We're going to have a transition ceremony today." And the little boy goes off behind a screen and he comes back dressed in girl's clothes with ribbons in his hair. And the students are told, that his name is now Susie and everybody's to call him Susie and that, he is now a she, her. Anyway, some of the other 5-year-olds went home to their parents and they were terribly confused and distressed.
Exactly.
And they were saying to their parents, "We don't want to change. We don't want to become a boy or a girl. If John can do it, can that happen to us?"
This could
Which was
happen to us.
very unprecedented. They did not expect that kind of reaction. But even given that reaction, the school did not relent,
No.
and they continued to teach gender ideology concepts from kindergarten onwards. I had a 10-year-old girl come to me. Her parents were concerned that, she was gender confused and so on. And I asked her what she thought her gender was. And she said, "I don't know. There are so many to choose from."
So, and what I often say to people, we have created the greatest mental health crisis in our children the world's ever seen, the West has ever seen. And I think it's not so big in undeveloped countries, but it is in Western countries. And I think, I mean, there's certainly other elements that come into creating the angst and the confusion and just all of the emotional upheaval and mental illness with children. But this is probably, in my eyes, this and cell phones together, they share a number one spot. And so we are purposely, as countries, as professionals, as the teachers and politicians, purposely confusing our children to the point, like you said, I don't know. I don't know who I am. Can you imagine, Diana, can you imagine when you were growing up? Um, Not having the security of absolutely knowing that you are a biological female. And I mean, I was the ultimate tomboy growing up. And if I had have been in this generation, I just think, oh my goodness, I would have probably bought into that. I was probably in the vulnerable sector and probably some other things. And and I would have been so easily influenced. And, I mean, I just think how horrific for these children. So there's a lot of lies. Um, Something you said just, when we actually first met a couple of weeks ago online, and it was about the biology of infants. And I had not even put this together, but you were talking about the fetus in the womb. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how we know male and female? So it's such like it's at such a young uh, early part of gestation, right?
Yes, yes. Well, one of the hundreds of myths propagated by the trans lobby is that children are assigned a sex at birth.
Yeah.
And, they talk about it as if it's an arbitrary thing. The language is so misleading that, you were assigned female at birth. You weren't biologically identified as a female. You were assigned this, name. And I think I might have been talking about the idea that every cell in a person's body identifies their sex. They're either double X female or XY male. And one of the major misinformation, mistruths propagated by gender ideology is that gender and sex are on a spectrum.
Mm.
And they use the existence of a condition called intersex to prove that, sex is not binary and gender is not binary. Um, Whereas intersex is a disorder of sexual development and it's incredibly rare.
That's right.
0.02% of young people are born with ambiguous genitalia because of some sexual dysfunction in the development of the fetus, and more frequently related to genetic aberrations. So instead of being XX or XY, we've got young people who are XYY or YXX. So they've got an additional chromosome that creates difficulties for them in their sexual development, as well as other areas of development. Some, have heart conditions, some will be infertile,
That's
and so forth. Um, and so it's a multiple propagation of lies to say that
right.
you are assigned a sex at birth and yet you're at liberty to correct that if it's wrong, and to say that sex is not binary, using intersex as the explanation as to why, it's not binary. So,
I have
uh,
I have an intersex friend who actually has allowed done an interview with me, and he is one of many who is so disgusted and actually he just hates being lumped into the umbrella, the trans umbrella. He said, it's so wrong. He said, I'm not trans. I have an anomaly, a sexual anomaly, but I am not, I am not trans. And yet they're all lumped in together. Something that you mentioned was that we can identify um, the, we can observe sex, the sex of an infant, the sex of a fetus from 6 weeks
mm,
gestation on. 6 weeks.
mm,
This isn't a mistake. You're not a mistake. Um, you're absolutely not assigned at birth. Your biological sex is predetermined, and it's observable by 6 weeks gestation. This is what is being thrown out.
mm,
All the biological fact and and truth is thrown out so that we can just embrace lies that destroy the children. And I think, you know, when you talked about first conversion therapy and not being allowed to treat these individuals according to psychotherapy, and particularly the whole area of trauma therapy, because often there are pre-existing mental health conditions with these children. Pre-existing meaning that before they decide that they are in the wrong body, they are already vulnerable. And a large percentage, I think between 32 and 42%, I've read different stats, so,
mm,
but
mm,
are autistic children. So these
mm,
are targeted, um, vulnerable children that are being really, really confused and really their lives being turned upside down. And I think that the horror of that is just starting to come to light as there's now, certainly in the US and Canada, um, detransistors, which those are the adolescents who don't go on hormones, that choose not to. There's a high percentage that desist. But for those that do go on hormones and even do surgeries, those are, and then later have regrets, the detransitioners, there are more and more coming forward. They're suing the doctors, um, and I think they have every right. I am waiting for the day, quite honestly, when we see lawsuits come against the education system as a whole, because lives have been absolutely ruined,
Mm,
ruined, and and there's a place where someone's got to be responsible for this,
mm,
and
mm.
the children have been taught. Um, well, like we've talked before, they've been consuming lies taught to them by the education system, and that's led to the whole destruction of the family, the nuclear family. Like let's come against the family in such a big way because it's breeding, like you said, a child comes home with their report card with a different name and the parent. The child's had two lives for the whole semester, the whole year. No wonder they're so upset and confused, and there's all kinds of things going on for the child. And then they come home and the parent is just absolutely flabbergasted. And where do they go? They have nowhere to turn except to accept the child's delusional thoughts, quite honestly. And it's the whole deconstruction of family and life, um, just normalcy of life that has really put everything on its head, so to speak.
One of the big issues, I think, where we need to make a lot more ground is the notion that gender identity should not be pathologized or cross-gender identity. But it's a huge conundrum for the trans lobby because in order to have these mutilating treatments perpetrated on young people, such as the cross-sex hormones and the gender surgeries, they have to have a medical condition. They have to be diagnosed with
Yes.
gender dysphoria. But the gender ideologists say that it's not a pathology, that it is a normal variation of human sexuality. But if that were the case, the young people wouldn't be able to afford their estrogen and their testosterone and their genital surgeries because they wouldn't have a medical condition. Um, so nobody's even resolved that or attempted to resolve it. So all of these logical absurdities that are propagated by the gender ideology are just brushed under the carpet. Nobody wants to talk about them. And if you do try to talk about it, well, then you're a transphobe and you're hateful
Yeah.
and you're doing, young people terrible harm by even raising the issue. So young people, I find enact the gender dysphoria, and you get these young girls saying, I can't shower, I can't stand the sight of my own body, and so I have to shower in the dark, or I can't shower at all, and I have to go to school, smelling really bad because I'm too afraid to shower because I hate looking at myself. So we get a lot of this kind of performative dysphoria, so that they can convince the medical people to give them these harmful treatments.
You know,
So, yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier about how academia, has been so complicit in this terrible kind of propagation of gender ideology. Even the premier journals in academia, such as The Lancet or Nature or
mhm.
Scientific American, they've all come out and I'm going to say pretended to agree or pretended to believe that sex is no longer on a spectrum and that sex is no longer primary. That gender is primary and gender is fluid and gender is on a spectrum. And they've come out in their editorials and made statements to that effect, which I think is the most reprehensible thing that any person can do because these people are scientists, they're educated.
Yes.
Some of them have even been formative in, the way we think about the human body. and now they're jumping on the bandwagon of gender ideology, knowing full well
Yes.
that they're lying outright about what they're saying.
I'm not
Um,
sure how they live with themselves.
no,
I
I
mean,
know.
I just could not. And
Well,
that,
we've got a sex discrimination commissioner in Australia who was answering questions to a Senate Estimates Committee last week. And she was asked to define what a woman was, what a man was. And she said she didn't understand the question. So the person repeated it and said, well, what is a biological man? And she said, I cannot give you a definition of a biological man. This is our National Sex Discrimination
yeah.
Commissioner, whose role is to protect women, and she couldn't even define a man or a woman.
But see, that's just kind of the outer limits of the absolute confusion that has been propagated upon our whole culture, and now we have, this whole we have a whole culture, a whole society that would be hard pressed to define male and female, a man or woman. What is a woman? And it's just like, well, it's an adult female. You just kind of have to shake your head. But the reality is, it's more than head shaking, because what it is doing, um, in seeding doubt, confusion, and this whole idea that you cannot trust. To me, it's seeding this distrust and mistrust of parents and family in such a huge way, because you can't trust your parents if they don't affirm you. They're wrong, we're right. And so this pitting of children, and it really is about deconstruction. And that's the really deep issue in this whole conversation, really.
Well,
The
you had a case in Canada a few years ago now where a father was charged with child abuse for
Yes,
failing to use his child's preferred pronouns.
yes, yes, in Vancouver. And
Yeah.
he was actually in jail for quite some time.
Oh.
Um, that I'm just trying to think of the last part of the outcome, because he had been released. The judge had told him not to have contact with his daughter unless he used her pronouns. I think his daughter was male, or was claiming to be male.
Mm.
And so he couldn't see her. And it was just such a horrific
Mm.
thing. And she was about 14 at the time. And she really wasn't wanting to change her gender. She was just questioning some things. And yet, because of the teacher, they hopped on the bandwagon. And because the parent was questioning, saying, just a minute. And really, the father was saying, let's wait till she's an adult and let her make her own decisions. But because there was a divorce, and this was a whole issue then between the husband and wife, and the wife made it part of the whole divorce thing, and what a mess, what a mess. And you see, that's what, if you stand up for your children, and we have others, like Billboard Chris, you've probably heard of.
Mm. Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes.
And others who have had children transition, who have taken up this fight, parents who have taken up this fight to just say, this is what happened to our family, and we don't want to have it happen to your
We
family.
had a case in the family court in Australia where the parents were divorced and the mother unilaterally decided to transition her
Yes.
4 or 5 year old son to a daughter and started dressing her in female clothes and exaggerating, the feminine. So she would paint his nails and put on eye makeup and frilly dresses and all of the rest of it. And the father was horrified and took her to court to gain custody because he was saying that she was the driving force, not the child behind
That's
the
right.
transition. Um, to his great credit, the judge in that matter transferred custody to the father.
Wow.
And the father then, tried to educate this child that he was a boy, he was always a boy, he will always be a boy and then a man. But the judge did give access of the child to the mother. And when the child went to have contact visits with the mother, she would just dress him in female clothes and do exactly what she was doing before. And so this child goes between houses. At one house, he's a male, at the other house, he's a female. And we already know the damage that that does to people. I don't know if you've heard of Walt Heyer.
Yes.
Um, yeah, this is what happened to him. He was a man, then he transitioned to a woman, then he transitioned back to a man. He was gender confused for
Yes.
most of his life. And we know what happens to young people who are put in that kind of invidious
Yes.
position, but it's going on everywhere.
Well, and you've touched on something that I think we need to mention here in the fact that moms, it's often the mothers who are really pushing a child into this whole idea of being usually a boy being a girl, or it can be the other way around. Um, and I read a report. I read a, oh dear, my dog just came into the room. I am so sorry. I thought the door was totally closed. Let me go put her out. Oh, very sorry. Okay, so much for that. We'll edit that little bit. She obviously thought she needed company. Um, so let me talk about mums for a minute. I think it was 1992. There was a research paper done, and when you could still research this, because now you probably couldn't do it. And so the the study was on young boys who had gender identity disorder because that's what it was previously. It was a disorder. And so, and it usually was young boys. It was very rare, very, very rare. But so there was a study done, and it found that 52% of these young boys had mothers who were borderline personality disordered. So that's a huge thing, Diana. This is mental illness at the extreme, so to speak, because borderline
Mhm.
personality disorder is very, very difficult to treat. And it is a very severe disorder. And so here these moms were themselves struggling with mental illness issues. And sometimes, and I mean, we've seen this, that moms decide to dress a child in the opposite sex clothes and treat them as the opposite sex. It doesn't start with the child often, it starts with the mom or the parents, but generally the mom. What do you say about that? What do you think about that?
Overwhelmingly, I believe it is the mothers who drive it.
Yes.
And yeah, that's a great concern because mothers are very influential
Yes.
to their children, especially, of children of very young age. So in my clinical experience, um, I would say that the mothers are the main drivers. I mean, I tend to see the sensible parents who are desperate to pull their child out of the gender cult, not to immerse them in the cult because those mothers go straight to the gender clinics or to the gender affirming therapists where they're going to get the answer that they want. But in the court cases that I've been involved in, and also, with my general kind of study and reading in the area, I would say that that is correct, that it's the mothers who drive it. Um, yeah, I mean, I have heard very few cases where the fathers are convinced that their child is transgender. They're either distant, they either don't get involved in the matter, or they're very much opposed, and it causes a great rift in the marital relationship that often ends in separation and divorce.
Yes,
Uh,
which of course creates a trauma for the child. But I
yes.
think often these moms, and when I see the whole phenomenon that we talked about, this pandemic of transgenderism, that there's pretty high stakes for moms who, and I'm thinking about I Am Jazz, the mother very, very enmeshed with the child and pushing the child. And there's a payoff for some of these mums in the sense that they get a lot of attention.
Mm,
And because society has doing the pat on the back, you're a great mom, you're doing everything right,
mm.
and there's no accountability for the behavior. So
Well, I think
children are
that
suffering.
in some of these mothers, I think it's a form that hasn't previously been identified, but it resembles Munchausen's by proxy,
Mhm.
uh, where the mother damages her child knowingly in
Yes,
order to fulfill her own needs for, recognition, acknowledgement, martyrdom, everything I do is for my child.
yes,
Uh, that kind of idea. So I think the underlying psychological dimension of Munchausen's by proxy in the medical field, where the mother makes the child deliberately ill by forcing it to ingest, certain chemicals and so on. It's a similar kind of pathology that you see in some of these mothers who are pushing their children into cross-sex identification.
yes. Well, and I think it's well, it's just so incredibly sad all the way around. I mean, you have that um, the whole mother influence, which has been documented highly in research in this whole area, and then you have the educational um, aspect and the teachers who are, you know, encouraging children to transition in the school setting.
Mm.
And you have doctors and the medical profession, and they've nowhere safe in the sense. And I have said to parents over and over in the last several years, don't send your children into the public school system. It is so unsafe
Mm.
because they are being indoctrinated. They're
Mm.
hearing this, they're being told lies 6 hours a day,
Yeah.
and you can't combat that um, at
No.
home with a couple hours in the evening. Uh,
I've had mothers come to me and say they've finally found out what's happening at school. For example, her son was sent to school dressed as a male because he was biologically male. At the school gate, he was met by female students and teachers who brought him the female school uniform. He would go into a private space and change his clothes. And the minute he walked into the playground, he had a female name and female pronouns. And the mother had absolutely no idea that this was happening. And when she found out, she was absolutely distraught, as you can imagine.
oh,
And, she wrote a letter to the principal and said, she demanded that this practice cease immediately, that the child was a minor and that, she had a parental authority. And the principal wrote back to her saying, my response is based on these 7 pieces of legislation. And he quoted all the legislation. The letter was clearly written by a lawyer, not a school principal. And it was like 3 pages long, justifying his malpractice. Um, and demonstrating that these principles have extraordinary powers now of in loco parentis,
Yes,
and they're backed by, you know, the education minister and the education department.
absolutely.
So this principal felt like he was on very solid ground to refuse the mother's request not to socially transition her child when he went to school. And I feel that is just a horrifying thing that
Yes.
parents don't know what's happening to their children once they leave the family home.
Tell me about the backlash. Are you witnessing in Australia a backlash coming against this whole ideology from parents, in by and large, or is there anything happening to refute this,
Sadly,
politically, or people standing up in any way?
look, you've got a handful of people standing up and they're being beaten down. Um, you know, I mean, I've had complaints to my professional association. I've had threats up to and including death threats. Um, I've been vilified on social media. I've been charged with vilification for using terms like social contagion and rapid onset gender dysphoria by the ACT Human Rights Commission. ACT is the Australian Capital Territory in Australia, Human Rights Commission. Um, and you do really feel under siege and beaten about the head for trying to talk sense into people that were once your colleagues, you know, people who've got PhDs or
I
medical
know.
degrees. They're educated people and they are talking compound nonsense and causing so much unbelievable harm to a generation of young people, and they're nowhere to be found in the debate. Most of them, you know, have gone silent. And we know in America there have been anonymous polls taken, and we know that about 70% of the American public are opposed to gender transition of
Yes.
minors. But you would never know that, you know, from the vocal presence of the trans lobby in every department of government, in all the social media platforms, everywhere. All we ever hear is the trans lobby voice. We very rarely hear people, you know, countering
Yeah.
that misinformation. And in Australia, it's terribly depressing and disturbing that we've had almost no shift in the power and influence of the trans lobby. And they get away with it. Like they make statements like the
Yes.
Cass review is not relevant to Australians, as if British and Australian people are somehow so different
Yeah.
that scientific, you know, findings related to one group of people who just happen to live in another country are not relevant, you know, to people in Australia. So
Well,
yeah, it defies understanding.
yes, it defies any sense of reality for sure.
Yeah.
And we have the same thing here, but I feel like there is a subtle change happening, and I think there are some politicians, and we have had a change in one of our um, provinces that has, in Alberta, there has been some um, clamping down on teaching gender ideology in the schools
Mm,
at young ages.
yes,
It's
yes.
just in the one province, but I think people are tending to wake up. I want to thank you for what you've done because I think it takes a lot of courage, Diana, to stand like you've stood. And I do get it. I do get it. Can you, as we wrap up, can you talk about your book, um, Genesis? No.
Intransigence.
Yes. Okay.
Intransigence. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous book. I really, really enjoyed it. Um, Tell our viewers a little bit about the book. We've talked about quite a bit about transgender for sure. But give us a little summary, I guess, a synopsis. And at the end of this broadcast, I will have a website and your book picture and all that up so that people can order it and they can read truth. It's so good to read truth.
Thank you. Yes. Look, the book is about trying to set the record straight with all the lies and misinformation propagated by the trans lobby. So early in the book, I look at the claim that transgenderism has been around since the beginning of time, and every nation, every ethnic group, every race has transgender people. So when you look at it closely, this is not the case. So people often point to countries like the Pacific Islands or Asia. So I'll just give you one quick example. In Samoa, which is a small island in the Pacific Ocean, um, there are what appear to be a large number of transgender people per head of population. But when you examine it, you find out that in this culture, families that are born without daughters choose one of their sons
Yes.
to be a daughter. So it's the parents who choose the son. It's not the son saying he's transgender. It's the parents saying, you will now be the daughter in this family. And they have a special name. They're called Fafa Afine, and it means dressed like a woman or being a woman in the manner of a woman. So there's lots of examples, cultural examples,
And this was
where
purposeful. It was
this is
purposeful
purposeful.
for,
Yes. Yes, it's
yeah.
cultural. It's cultural. So if there's no girl to help the mother in the family home, that's what it is. So I've got a few examples of how the history has been changed for the transgender lobby, to make it more attractive to them. Then I look at every concept propagated by the trans lobby and I dismantle it, deconstruct it, and show it for the lie that it is. And we have talked about a couple of those things today, like using intersex people to prove a spectrum of gender and sex. And this whole dilemma about, is a person who is transgender mentally unwell, those kinds of issues. So there's lots of those that I deconstruct.
Yes.
Then I do a chapter on normal gender and sexual identity development because horrifyingly, the trans lobby does not understand anything about normal gender and sex development because they propagate nonsense and stupidity.
Oh dear. We froze.
And she gives these stupid examples of, 18-month-old children who are finding ways of telling their parents that they're transgender. It just is so beyond belief and comprehension. You just go into a state of shock,
Yes.
that PhD developmental psychologist could be talking such rubbish. So I talk about how sexual orientation comes about, the
Yes.
biological factors, the social factors, and so forth. And then my big kind of soapbox topic is social contagion.
Yes.
Uh, and I hope I demonstrate quite convincingly that social contagion is the driving force of transgender identity in young people, but not only in young people, also in the institutional capture of all the organisations we talked about. Uh,
Absolutely.
and how that has come about and how unbelievable it is that these people can do it. Um, so then, I talk about detransition. I talk about the dangers of cross-sex hormones and gender surgery. And then I finish on a very large chapter on the psychotherapy of young people and their families, with young people presenting as transgender. So
And that
that's
gives
it.
hope.
Yes, it does. Yes. If these children are managed appropriately, most of them will exit the gender maze and be who they were biologically and developmentally meant to be if they had not been interfered with in the way that the trans lobby interferes with the development of these children.
It's a fabulous book, and I'm hoping that many will pick it up. I think particularly for parents,
Mhm.
grandparents, and even maybe specifically for professionals who are starting maybe to go, just a minute, maybe everything's not right in this world, in this whole area of transitioning children. And I hope and pray that more and more professionals will begin to see the light of this. And I think your book will really help them with that. I think it's very, very clear. The research is clear. And it's a good work. It's a really good work you've done, Diana.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for being with us today. I just really, really admire your courage. I admire your tenacity and the honesty and the integrity that you bring to this discussion. It's very much this sense of, wow, we can breathe when we hear honest words. And truth does give us a freedom that we don't have when there's so much confusion out there. So we bring truth to this situation, to this discussion, and we want to hopefully clear up some of the confusion that people are struggling with. So thank you
Thanks.
again. Any final comments before we end the show today?
Oh, no, I think we've talked enough. But
We've got lots.
thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, I'm just so pleased to have you. Thanks very much. And
Thank you.
yeah, and stay tuned, everyone, because I am going to post the book and the website and give you more information at the end of this show. Thanks so very much.
Thank you.